So on today's episode, you're going to learn about real-time LTV, which, according to our guest, is a North Star metric for e-commerce. It's a great episode you don't want to miss, so do stay tuned. Welcome to the 2x e-commerce podcast. I'm your host, Kunle Campbell. In today's episode, we're talking with Tobi Konitzer. Tobi is... Let me start out first by saying that if you are into data science, if you're into retention, this episode is a must listen to. And that's because Tobi is a PhD at Stanford University with a background in researching like public opinion at the forefront of machine learning. He worked with Facebook prior to this, set up a startup, prior to this, and now he's using AI to determine what is called real-time lifetime value, that's RLTV, which essentially does not wait for data, for purchase data, like historic purchase data to determine your LTV. It, with machine learning and certain data points, determining LTV based on the first purchase per channel, so you could optimize 4 channels. So in this episode, I grill him as to what RLTV is, how they come about, the metrics. And I think what was more insightful from this is other uses of our RLTV, potential uses of RLTV into other e-commerce tooling or your e-commerce tech stack to make them more efficient at personalization. I think that's where the real power is. So this episode is really geeking out in retention, and Tobi knows his stuff. And he's I didn't even mention his company. It's Ocurate. And yeah, it was a decent conversation, I have to say, with Tobi. One thing he mentions is, you don't have to be a Facebook with regards to experimentation, but you must embrace a culture of experimentation to really, really get the most out of real-time LTV, that's RLTV. It's an interesting concept, and I'm glad I'm covering it on this podcast first. And, before many other podcasts. I hope other podcasts haven't covered it yet, but it is a very, very interesting concept, and I'd encourage you to listen if you're very well into retention. I recall our previous episode was a masterclass on essentially retention marketing with Jess Chan. This is a follow up on this the new North Star metric, according to Tobi, called real time LTV. So enjoy this episode, and we'll catch you on the other side. Hey Tobias, welcome to the 2x e-commerce podcast.
Hey Kunle, very, very excited to be on.
Amazing. So where are you calling in from?
I'm actually today in the gray, rainy city of San Francisco, which is just a typical summer for us over here.
Yes, indeed. I've been in San Francisco over summer, and the weather is a bit temperamental. So do you live in San Francisco full time, or are you passing by?
No, I do. Myself and the family live in San Francisco, and actually really like it. So for all these negative viewpoints on San Francisco, they're going to provide a controversial / conflicting opinion here.
Interesting. So you're a handful of Stanford University alumni I've had on this podcast. Do you want to sort of give your journey thus far? What's brought you here? So you're founder, CEO of Ocurate, which is essentially it's a predictive AI type platform, which we're going to talk about. There's lots to talk about there, but what's been your journey thus far?
Yeah, I mean, I'll definitely say a non-linear journey. But probably my background is best described as using data and machine learning to very specifically predict the effect of interventions on human behaviors. Yes, I did a PhD, computational social science at Stanford. I was at Facebook Research for a little bit, working on something very similar, and then founded a company called PredictWise, that is a data company, a targeting company in the political space, really building out targets of persuadable, elastic individuals that can be persuaded using big data and machine learning. And ultimately, without getting too much into that too deeply, got tired of U.S. politics. Maybe living in Europe, you'll understand the noise of the discourse is one that I think over the long term is not that beneficial to your health. I'll disclose we are Predictive as a company that is on the progressive, here in the U.S. the liberal side of things, but I was always interested in understanding pain points of B2C companies, of internet consumer companies, and started working a little bit with companies in that space after the 2020 election. And really, that's where the idea comes from that we're going to talk about, and the big vision behind this company, which is to develop a central KPI, an organizing principle, if you will, against which everything in the internet to consumer space is measurable, scalable, comparable. And that central KPI has become predictive real-time LTV, what we call RLTV for us. And that's very much at the core of what Ocurate has been doing over the last 2 years.
Okay, so that's a pretty huge mission in the sense that, in commerce at least, most brands look at their LTV and the LTV to CAC ratio to kind of offer guidance for their strategy, whether it's an annual strategy or whether it's a quarterly strategy. You get your LTV, and that would dictate how much you're willing to spend from an acquisition standpoint, and it is almost like your ammunition. So if I hear you correctly, your thesis here is actually what you lead with your company at Ocurate is we should go a bit deeper by going for this RLTV, which is a predictive LTV. Do you want to break down the difference between a standard LTV most of our listeners are used to this RLTV? How do they sort of differ?
Yeah, Kunle, I think that's a really, really important question. And I think there is probably a lot to unpack here. I think D2C brands have heard for the last 15 years from all kinds of wise people, investors, private equity. Oh, guys, LTV is the North Star. You need to do everything LTV. But I think that the current metrics, the current LTV metrics that are in circulation, even the predictive LTV metrics, are just not really amenable to, for example, change the way that I, as a consumer-facing company, interact with my customers. And I think you alluded to that, right? LTV, even predictive LTV, the way that it is done now, is much more of a guidance. I would say it's a diagnostic, right? By the way, that most LTV machine learning works is you wait for purchase data coming in over 3-4 months, and you can then project out what is the revenue of, say, Bob, who has been with your company in the last year, has bought regularly. What is the revenue that Bob will bring in over the next year? Again, that's a metric that is good for VCs if you want to sell the company. It's good for your overall strategy. Should you put more money into, for example, acquisition or retention? Yeah, these things can be answered. But of course, it will never change how you interact with your individual customers on a day-to-day, right? If you need that much purchase data to project out what the future revenue is, well, at that point, these guys are good customers. You probably don't want to do anything differently, right? If you've been a client of a shoe company for a year, have regularly bought shoes, you're a good customer as is. And if that's the first time I can come up with your LTV, well, not that interesting, right? We call that the applicability gap, okay? The mission behind our LTV, behind predictive real-time LTV, is really to close that applicability gap, is to offer LTV as a dynamic predicted metric that you can, and we have built certain applications on top of that really change the way that you interact with your customers early in the customer journey as a internet consumer company.
Okay. So how do you do it?
How does the technology behind it work, or what are the
Yeah.
applications?
Yes. So how does it happen? How do you predict it in real time?
Yeah. No easy answer to that, because that has kept me up for probably the last 18 months, right? We always were convinced that this sort of task, right, if we want to push LTV into a KPI that you can actually make decisions on, that kind of task depends on the right data calibrated for the right machine learning, right? And right machine learning calibrated for the right data. What the right data is, and I'm not going to describe the whole journey as to how we came about. This was more or less a very dialectic and empirical process. But
No, well, I'm open. I'm open to. I really want to. I'm inquisitive.
okay,
I want to know.
very good.
Please just go
Very
for
good.
it.
So we started with, if we want to predict LTV, for example, before the first purchase occurs, that's what we're talking about here, right? If we want to predict a zigzag LTV that changes every day while the purchase cycle it takes months, we obviously need external data that is not purchases. The first idea kind of came from my last job. It was pretty much a stupid idea in retrospect. Is we had built out this massive database of demographics starting with voter records, actually in the US. And we had said, okay, if we overlay that data with the customer data, we solve what we internally call this cold start problem. So particularly, how can you predict LTV without any signal? There is just nothing, right? Unfortunately, of course, this database that we built out is a very static database. Your demographics are going to change ever so slowly, right? Every year you become a year older. At least that's true for me. I think it's true for most people. But there is just no dynamicism in there that you could exploit to get to that zigzag, always changing revenue potential, right? So ultimately, I think the answer came serendipitously, which I hate to admit, but I think that's the truth, where companies that we've been working with started to send us more and more what's called event stream data. So, I think a very easy starting point to that is how many emails did you open? Telemetry data, behavioral data, things that actually inherently are dynamic. And we started to see a relationship between these data points and LTV. And ultimately, what we have done is we've built out I think, pretty sophisticated data collection technology. We call that thing OccuBoost, but that thing collects every behavioral data point on site that is related to LTV in a PII, in a privacy, in a personal identity preserving way. So I'm going to be a little bit more specific here. Say you are an anonymous customer who comes to a hair care site. You look at 3 5-star reviews. You spend 30 seconds on each, and then you go and you look at a specific 1-star review and you spend 5 minutes there. It's that kind of data we collect that then goes into our big machine learning engine. And maybe in closing, I'm going to describe the intuition behind the machine learning, and I hope that starts to make sense. Now, again, let's just assume you're coming to this hair care site. We're going to collect this behavioral data from you. What reviews you look at, what products you look at, what pages you load, what product display pages you look at, what educational content you consume for how long, right? And then the machine learning essentially says, okay, Kunle's data, or ID 5712 stars data, right, anonymized, the digital fingerprints that individual leaves behind, does it match the digital fingerprints in terms of purchasing data of existing customers or not? In other words, do you behave just like a customer who spends a lot all the time based on your behavioral data on site, or do you behave like someone who buys once and drops dead, right? And with this sort of technology in the machine learning side, we can do two things. We can predict LTV before any purchase occurs with high accuracy, and that's a big component here, is validating the accuracy, and then update these predictions based on any engagement that you have with a brand, not relying on purchase data.
It's very interesting, but from my perspective, with the information you have from predicting data about what user ID, PIP, 101 is worth, essentially, how's that going to change how I market? So with LTV or my CAC to LTV ratio, I know that okay, if my LTV is $500 over an 18-month period, typically with a customer, and my margins are so much, then I am willing to spend say $200 on on any acquisition platform to acquire them. So that dictates my budget. It dictates the ads I create. So it gives me insight to prepare and execute. But if this data is coming in real time, is that not just data overwhelm? What do you do in real time, particularly for a first time customer? How does that feed into decision making? The problem with analytics out there is we're overwhelmed with data, and we don't know what to do with data. So how are best in class brands using this data effectively to essentially make more money, or or attract the more of the customers who align with them from a revenue and even value standpoint?
Super important question. Again, I think we can call that the applicability gap, right? And I think it's super important that we have an opinion on that, right? I think it's super important to avoid the trap of saying, here is an API and real-time LTV, now go have fun. And I think we learned that the hard way a little bit. We've built two core applications on top of RLTV that really our customers use with a proven track record of changing the way that they're engaging with their prospects and customers to generate revenue. And here's what they are. I'm maybe going to go. I'm going to go with one, and then I'm going to stop there, and we're going to talk about the second one maybe later. But I think The first one is one thing that you alluded to, which is being able to evaluate acquisition strategies on this North Star metric of LTV to CAC. So, what is the value, the monetary value of the customer, say in the first 12 months, divided by how much money did I spend to acquire that customer, right? The big difference is we can do it in real time. And now I think it's important to address what the status quo approach is that most direct-to-consumer companies have to rely on, right? And I think we can make this very concrete. Say you acquire 2 customers from Google, right? All you can really do is say, hey, those are 2 conversions, and for the same money on Facebook, I got 1 conversion. So I'm going to go with the 2 conversions, and I'm going to spend more money there. But that's not what you want to know. And I'm going to try to get a little mathematical without getting too mathematical, right? I think, Kunle, if you allow me to really understand why optimizing on conversion is short-sighted, we have to do a little bit of background math. Are you okay with that?
Sure, let's do it.
Let's do it. Okay. So let's keep this in mind. We're going to close that parentheses here at the end, this why conversion optimization, which is all you can do, is a bad idea, right? I think we're going to have to go back to the principles of revenue. The principle of revenue distribution in a direct-to-consumer company is governed by the Pareto principle. That thing states that 80% of the effect is generated by 20% of the cause. So in this case, it means that 80% of the revenue come from 20% of your customers. And I think if your listener base takes one thing away from this conversation, it should be that one, right? That means that your high value customers generate 16x in sale compared to your regular customers, right? Now that's a big difference. And it turns out it's a much bigger difference than conversion. Again, we can do a little bit of math, but the difference between getting the right conversion and the wrong conversion and getting any conversion versus no conversion is 4x, right? Make this a little bit more concrete. Our previous example, you're now optimizing over the campaign that got you 2 conversions versus 1, right? But if the 1 conversion would have converted a high value customer, you're actually missing out by a factor of 8x, right? And that is really what RLTV is. It allows you to evaluate acquisition strategies not by conversion, not by the initial sales data, but by the predictive revenue that each customer brings in the first 12 months. It gives you a much more complete picture. And ultimately, and this is sort of going long, but it helps Google and Facebook to optimize their bidding in ways that weren't possible before. Because we're able to tell Facebook, look, you're looking at Bob, Bob's LTV will be $60. So dear Google, your bidding strategy now can be much more efficient, right? And I think the overall story here is that either based on platform optimization, but even if you just do channel strategy optimization based on RLTV to CAC, you can really increase your revenue based on the acquisition campaigns that you run compared to the status quo.
Now you're speaking our language when you brought the Facebook and Google, examples into play. So does that mean that, with Ocurate, with your platform, that you're able to sort of push that data in real time back to advertising channels, such as Facebook particularly, or the Meta platform, so they're fed more information from a conversion standpoint, and then your predicted LTV, and if yes, how does that happen?
Yeah, so I want to make clear here that I'm hurt. That is obviously a very smart question and shows that you have a lot of experience in the space and know what you're talking about. I sort of talked about two different things, and I think you picked up on this. One is the world today that RLTV enables you, which is really understanding the LTV to CAC of every channel in real time, putting more money into these things that work on better signal, right? Based on a much better metric, and downspending things that don't work. Now, I alluded to something that you picked up on correctly, which is ultimately the ability to push that LTV, that RLTV, back into the acquisition platforms and then change their internal optimization procedure. That's a different thing, right? If we can do that, then Google can really adjust its bidding strategy. And this is what happens under the hood, right? On your behalf, Google is placing a bid based on every prospect on your behalf. It just happens in the black box, right? If we can do that, then we can give Google and Facebook the power to do this with efficiency and knowledge and accuracy that's just never been there before. And we think we can do that, okay? I think that's quite revolutionary. Ultimately, how does something like that work? Well, without going too much into the details, there is a way in which we can establish a feedback loop between the acquisition platforms, individuals that come to your direct-to-consumer e-commerce site, and their LTV, and push that back in real time. And ultimately, this process that I just alluded to on these acquisition platforms adjusting their bidding with this data that just hasn't been there before, this is something that's called value-based bidding. Now,
yes,
we have to do some R&D around that. To me, there is very high hope that this will actually change the status quo of acquisition. Facebook was my former employer. We know that this is where these platforms are going. That's where they spend their money on, right? If something like that will work, and we figured out the technology to do that, which we've already done, I think will revolutionize the way that acquisition has been happening for the last 20 years. But my suggestion, Kunle, before I get ahead of myself as a CEO of a company, which is sort of my job, we want to be careful. Our background here is in academia. We're very big on R&D and testing. If that test comes positive, I suggest we do a 2.5-hour podcast around that.
But they are value-based lookalike audiences on Meta advertising. I believe from what I'm reading here, there's an SDK. And from past experience, we used to essentially upload CLTV data, but that was exported from platforms such as Shopify. So it was static and it was not real time, CLTV.
And Kunle, let me ask you, let me make a guess here, because we've tried this for many times as well. It didn't really work.
Sometimes it worked marginally. It was not like 50%, double type thing. It was, marginal. It all depends on whether you've maxed out that audience or not. But yeah, it was relative. It didn't always work. It worked sometimes.
Uh,
So I guess what I'm trying to get to, Tobias, is, do you think that there's going to be mass adoption of real-time LTV? It's not my first time actually hearing about real-time LTV. I've just not paid sufficient, focus on it to really. In fact, it's my first time in public actually speaking to the topic. But do you see the focus in general moving to real-time LTV? Do you think platforms like Shopify Plus will, or even third-party tools? I know Ocurate is well into this. Will essentially be feeding this data, and then would acquisition channels also be utilizing this data fed to them, from their customers or advertisers, websites or assets? Where do you see this playing out in the future, and how are your customers, your best in class customers, using this data effectively? Because it's all well and good knowing about this in theory, but the question is applicability and just essentially using it for competitive advantage.
Yeah, I think two questions that we should maybe dissect a little bit, take apart. I'm gonna make some notes now too, because my brain is, my memory at least, my short-term memory is not what it used to be five
So
years
it's a
ago.
very long-winded question. I'm notorious for that.
But I'm a good note taker and I like long questions. So there we go. I'm going to start with the first one, which is how do we see the future? And yes, I think you describe it very well. I'm convinced that this will be the future. I'm convinced that a metric like RLTV will become the KPI that is an anonymized KPI that exists everywhere in the ecosystem, from Shopify to being pushed to ad platforms, to being the organizing principle within the D2C companies as well. I think it's going to have a lot of downstream effects. By the way, I hope that we're the one who bring it about, but that may not be the case. It may be in 2 years, it may be in 3 years. I'm convinced that it'll go there, and it'll have a couple of downstream effects. I think the big downstream effect is you have all these martech companies, ad tech companies that are focused on what I will call a misguided derivative of LTV. Maybe it is conversion, right? Lots of platforms out there that say we're going to increase your conversion rate by 1x or 10% or something like that, by factor of by adding 1x or 10% or something. And it's appealing right now to D2C brands because that's a language they've been speaking for a long time. But as we just outlined, it's the wrong thing to focus on, right? Absolutely the wrong thing to focus on. Another example, and I should maybe specify this again, because a conversion is not made equal to conversion. You get a 16x conversion, it's a big difference from getting a 1x conversion in terms of monetary power of the customer, right? Another example of product recommendation tools. Many product recommendation tools out there that do something in the black box based on some correlative analysis. I think that ultimately the penetration of RLTV as organizing principle will mean that all these sort of adjacent tools that don't really speak to each other will ultimately disappear. And I think it'll be for the better for D2C companies that I think are helplessly overwhelmed by all kinds of software solutions that address little its and bits of their customer journey, of their pain points, but never the whole damn thing. And I think it'll make that market better. I do think that obviously the foundational principles of D2C still apply, which is build a good product that customers like. That's, nobody talks about that, but that's always, I think, the necessary condition to do anything. And frankly, in my journey, I've seen a lot of folks that haven't done that. When investors invest a lot of money in D2C companies, we've seen companies that had a higher cost of goods sold versus sales price, where the optimal number of customers was 0. Right. So I think that plus the foundations of building a consumer-centric product will at some point displace everything and will be the future of everything. Just the question is when, and the question is how. And I hope we have a role in this. Right. So that's, go ahead.
Yeah. So I'm not a futurist, but I really see a use case here for our LTV, based on the fact that it is the metric feeding SaaS-based solutions for D2C consumers, rather than a metric that feeds into like immediate decision making by the e-commerce manager or e-commerce marketer or what have you. I think if you use real time, LTV as fuel to power up essential modules like cross selling, upselling, to power up acquisition, to power up, personalization in real time. So it's really, it's really existing at the data layer infrastructure and feeding all of this, and it's proprietary and unique, and it's acceptable, single source of truth for so many tools. They'll more efficiently deliver what they're meant to deliver to D2C merchants. I think because those tools are more efficient in working in real time to optimizing user experience, as compared to me. I'm sat in my dashboard as an e-commerce manager. I'm getting real-time LTV. What the heck am I going to do with it? But if that's just piped into tools that I put out there, automation tools, and this is a nice segue into Chat GPT. If that's sort
I
of fed
do.
into all these tools and apps there.
I think that's an excellent point. I don't want to interrupt you, Kunle, but
Yeah.
I think
Sure.
what
No,
you're
go for it. Yeah.
describing is RLTV as the base layer of a completely vertically integrated stack of technology tools, and I could not agree
Correct.
more. We don't need to
Correct.
do all of it, right? Our vision is really to, and I think you said it very, very well, to make RLTV the fuel, that single source of truth. And if there is a churn tool on top of that uses derivatives of that metric, that's great. If there is an upsell tool, a product recommendation tool that uses this metric or builds derivatives off of that metric, that's great. And I think that yes, I think that probably provides a little bit more detailed vision of what I just outlined. I think you're absolutely right on this.
Interesting. Super interesting. And then the other bit of the question, the original question. Now I've lost my chain of, because I broke you off, myself, which I apologize for that.
I have a note on this.
Yeah.
Is I think you also asked it, how are our customers using that data
Yeah, your best
now?
in class customers
And
using
it
it.
actually it's a nice connection to this sort of stipulation on the future, because we have to obviously start to build some of these vertical integrations ourselves, right? And we
Right.
decided to basically have two vertical areas of integration. One is really that evaluation of all acquisition strategies, right? So in very concrete terms, we offer you a dashboard in which you see the LTV to CAC of everything you try immediately, right? Again, that doesn't really exist yet. But because we can predict LTV before the first purchase, immediately after the first purchase, we can essentially say to you, look, last week you tested 50 variations on content with ChatGPT, and you ran on 10 channels, and here's the exact LTV to CAC, meaning the 12 months LTV total and average over the customer acquisition cost for all these things, and you scale up what's working, you scale down what's not working. We have some really nice case studies out there. I think one with Good Clean Love shows that these guys increased the number of their high LTV customers by 19% just doing that, with then outsized effects on revenue north of 15%, right?
So is this split testing copy, on-site copy?
If you will, yes. It's essentially whatever you run. We're agnostic as to what you run, but we give you,
Okay.
even if you say, and this was the case study that we have, I'm going to run ads on 15 channels. That's what I usually do. We then put the dashboard on top and say, look, channel 1, 2, and 3 have last week had an LTV to CAC of 7-1. Put your money here. And of course, next week that may look very differently, because channels change all the time, right? Acquisition platform algorithms change all the time. So allowing you that dynamicism in really redistributing your money in a much more efficient and time granular manner.
Yeah, there's also the challenge of like creative. So if you just perhaps plugged into your Facebook advert a winning creative, it might just spike those metrics up from Facebook, as over time. Okay, that makes a lot of sense. That makes a lot of sense. So for people who want to find out more about Ocurate, you're on Ocurate.com, which is OCURAT.com. What's a sweet spot for D2C brands that work with you? What sorts of D2C brands really benefit from the data and the services you offer?
Yeah, first of all, first question, you're right. You can find a lot more at Ocurate.com, OCURATE.com. You can also drop me a note. I'm always interested in having conversations such like this conversation that I tremendously enjoy, but with founders of D2C brands, talking about predictive analytics, the future of AI, organizing principles, homogenization, all these topics that we hit now. Drop me a note at Tobi and Ocurate.com. And this is how we can get that conversation started. I always love to have those. As to what are the right, what do you have to be as a D2C company to fully take advantage of what we have to offer? I'd say two things. The applications that we build out really lend themselves to spending money on acquisition. If you don't spend any money on acquisition, you probably don't need to sweat evaluating acquisition strategies correctly. That's one. I think the other use case really that we're after, which we haven't talked about much, is actually one that's really near and dear to my heart, is offering a central measurement variable, a central criterion against which you can evaluate all your A/B tests that you run internally. And I think there is lots, running experiments and coming up with an experimental program is hard, right? We offer RLTV essentially as a one-stop metric that allow you to run them faster, make them comparable, and understand the effect on revenue pretty much in real time. If you want to leverage that value proposition, Kunle, that's the other big application that we build out. Our other selective, more vertically integrated approach in experimentation. You obviously need to have a culture of experimentation, right? I don't think you need to have as mature an experimentation program as Facebook, for example, did, where learned a lot of the lessons that we're now applying. But you should have a culture of experimentation in your company, and then I think it's a great use case to do all the experimentation against a more efficient outcome, which is RLTV.
And do you plug? So how does like a VWO, which is what's the VWO, which is like a split testing platform, a CRO platform, how does it sort of get the real-time LTV from yourselves? So how do you work?
Great question.
With
it actually works the other way. So you run your experiments however you want to run them. We can log what's called the individual level treatment assignment, which is all we need to know, right? We need to know whether ID 215 was a member of the control group or actually got the treatment. We can log that to the way that we collect data. And then all these experiments can be evaluated on the Ocurate platform. But the nice thing, we don't have to worry about how we get the data from X to Y. Do we need to push the data into these platforms, which is notoriously hard, right? Can't really push data into Optimizely on these others. We can just log it passively, and you can simply evaluate these experiments on our platform much more quickly and in a much more comprehensive and exhaustive manner through RLTV.
Tobias or Tobi, it's been a pleasure having you on the 2x e-commerce podcast. I will link to Ocurate in the show notes, and also your social. I think you're quite active on LinkedIn.
Thank you, Kunle, for having me. I am newly fairly active on LinkedIn, so we can also connect there, but I tremendously enjoyed the conversation, and thank you for the excellent questions.
Incredible. Cheers.